And we are rolling on June 1st, 2017 at UCLA, where we are about to hear a debate on gun control. Most specifically, we are wondering about what would be the most effective policy to keep the mentally ill from obtaining guns. What would be the most effective policy for keeping the mentally ill from obtaining guns? On the affirmative will be Sam Brady. On the negative will be Sarah Kim. As that great movie Listen to Me once said, let the debates begin.
This proposition is to be presented in the affirmative. This debate seeks to enact effective policy that would keep the mentally ill from obtaining and keeping firearms. Just really quickly going over definitions, mental illness encompasses a broad range of medical conditions marked primarily by sufficient disorganization of personality, mind, or emotions to impair normal psychological function. So really getting into the heart of this, we need to talk about what is the problem. And in this brief, we're really mentioning that the problem here that gets a lot of attention, but not the problem we seek to address, is the problem of mass shooting. Because they account for a very small amount of violent acts, but their actions are disproportionately represented, and it creates a stigma.
Good.
This is a concerning problem, but it's one that cannot adequately be addressed by the policy that we're trying to propose. It would be like trying to find a needle in a haystack.
Good.
Furthermore, violence by the mentally ill only counts for 4% of the national average. So we're not talking about trying to keep guns to protect the rest of the people. Really, the problem we want to address is primarily suicide in the by the part of mentally ill individuals. This is because the population with mental illness is at much greater risk of suicide than the general population. And when guns are involved, the success rate of carrying out suicide is significantly greater. By not having stricter gun laws for the mentally ill, tens of thousands of preventable deaths can occur every year. National data from Swanson shows that more than 60% of gun deaths are suicide, and mental illness is a major underlying cause. Furthermore, from the same source, having a prolonged mental illness increases the risk of suicide between 47 to 74% when compared to a non-mentally ill population. So they're at least half, if not almost twice as likely to kill themselves, and guns are a major utility for doing that. And how big is the problem? Suicide, particularly by firearm, is reaching epidemic proportions. Suicide is the 10th leading cause of death among all ages. It is a preventable means of death, and the numbers each year continue to rise. Left unchecked, this problem is likely to continue growing. The vast majority of those who go through with it have a diagnosable mental illness. Looking at the statistics, it's clear to see that guns create massive problems when attempting to quell these problems. They directly correlate with suicide attempts, accounting for over half of successful attempts. That is to say, from the CDC, over 42,773 suicides reported, 21,000 of which were by firearms. So that is a very big portion of it. Furthermore, from the School of Social Work, more than 90% have a diagnosable mental illness of those who actually commit the suicides. So we see that this is absolutely a problem that is very much directly related with mental illness, directly related with guns, and when a gun is used, there's an 80 to 90% chance the wound will be fatal. This is extremely important because not only are many of these deaths preventable, possessing a firearm drastically increases the likelihood of making an attempt in the first place, as well as making the attempt more likely to be successful. Guns are the biggest problem by far when a mentally ill person decides to take their life. When examining the statistics, clear indicators emerge that show guns are one of the biggest problems in completing a suicide. More often than not, suicide would not have taken place without a gun being present. 90% of all suicide attempts involve a means other than guns and are fatal far less often, from Miller and Hemingway in 2014. More than 90% of those who survive a suicide attempt never attempt to go on and try again. This means that even though we think of suicide as being the final end of somebody, in reality it's very often simply a decision, a quick decision in the moment. So we need to make sure that those decisions that are made in the moment aren't fatal, because if they can survive and get help and get treatment, then they have a chance to continue living in the future, and this is extremely important. Looking at the ways in which people choose to commit suicide shows why guns are largely a bad idea. They are too effective and prevent an otherwise likely outcome of a suicidal person getting help. This is because there is no chance of reconsidering and a minuscule chance of surviving suicide. studies suggest that suicide attempts often occur shortly after people decide to kill themselves, reducing a wait period. Those who do not use a gun are more likely to survive their own attempts and be able to get help after the fact. So why do we have the problem? Gun control for the mentally ill is woefully inadequate. Even when a person gives clear indication of having serious threats of violence or suicide, most states do not have effective means of removing firearms from them, and an even worse ability to keep firearms away for a significant portion of time. This creates a significant barrier for allowing people to get the help they need, and protecting the general population from some of the more preventable instances of violence. Currently, the only way to federally ban someone from obtaining a firearm is if they are involuntarily committed to a psychiatric facility, which we know that the vast majority of people who are mentally ill are not going to be committed to something like that, so they're not going to have any access to having their gun taken away. The focus on mass shooting and lone gunmen creates a larger problem when discussing gun control and mental illness. It creates a significant stigma around mentally ill people and prevents them from getting even more help. Many do not want to be associated as being the type of individual that commit a mass shooting. However, when looking at the statistics, the overwhelming majority will not pose an increased risk of violence to others. The vast majority of mentally ill people are not violent. However, over 46% of Americans feel that those with serious mental illness are far more dangerous, so they're being blamed for this violence that they didn't cause. What is the solution? One effective means of removing guns from the mentally ill is to have a voluntary list they can place themselves on, which can prevent them from obtaining guns for a certain period of time. This helps decrease the stigma and also allows those with more short-term illness to protect themselves while seeking proper help. It does not unjustly take away people's rights who have more temporary problems, but it certainly means that those, as we mentioned before, being that suicide is often a in-the-moment decision, if they have to wait a significant amount of time in order to get the weapon, that could prevent them from ever making that decision in the first place. Those who show clear signs of recurrent suicidal behavior or major depression, prolonged indicators of violence, or suffer from severe mental illness should be entirely barred from owning a gun, even if it is involuntary. This is a common-sense approach that only prevents those with the most risk to be barred from owning a gun, and past a certain point, protecting the safety of an individual becomes more important than their right to own a gun.
Good.
Will the solution work? There is current legislation being proposed that offers the mentally ill to voluntarily put themselves on the NICS list. There is evidence that if it is implemented correctly, those who choose to use this service are at a lower risk of suicide. The precaution is the most common-sense approach to help. It gives the person temporary help and removes the risk of making an impulse decision. A study found by creating a long enough wait period, around 30 days, a person who places themselves on the list will likely be over their crises by the time they obtain a gun. Another measure would require a judicial review before a person can get off the list. While more restricting, it would put the most effective barrier in keeping the mentally ill from being a danger. There is also precedent to deny that access to firearms is a substantial risk. Policymakers agree that the protection of people outweighs the civil liberties of those who pose a threat to themselves or others. Preventing suicide is likely a sufficient constitutional justification for sweeping prohibitions, and we even saw in the famous court case D.C. v. Heller, Scalia's majority opinion saying that we could potentially justify taking away or keeping guns from those who are mentally ill.
Yeah.
So, on balance, we think that this outweighs
Is that time?
and stand open for cross-examination. Yeah.
Is that 7?
Yeah, I actually went a little bit over. Like
Okay.
20 seconds.
I now stand open for cross-examination and points of clarification.
I now stand open for cross-examination and points of
Oh, would you stand close to each other and continue facing me and not look at each other when you ask and answer the questions? Sarah, could you stand closer to Sam?
Do you want me to time?
Yeah.
3 minutes, right?
Yep. Go.
Okay, so there's two issues that I want to bring it up. Basically, so you're saying that suicide a problem that has to strictly do with the guns, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you put it that way, there are many methods of persons who do suicide, right? We're talking about strings, sharp materials. So by strictly seeing the mentally ill, I mean, if you're stating that they should take away the guns, then does it mean that they should take away all these things around them? That could potentially mean, they take away, which could take away their lives.
I think I understand the argument you're making in terms of saying that there are other methods of killing yourself, but the reason we're specifically focusing on gun is mostly because of the fatal nature of it. Because of things like overdosing on pills, stabbing yourself, trying to poison yourself, these things have a much lower actual success rate. And that's why they can actually be used many individuals who attempt those can then get help afterwards. But guns are very fatal, very final, and they're also used in about half of the successful suicides, which is why we think that it's a major enough problem that we can take those away without it being far too overreaching into people's lives.
Okay, so you're saying that this has, okay, so you're saying that this fundamental right, and we're talking about this, you know, Second Amendment, which everybody has, right?
Mm-hmm.
According to like a lot of studies shows that there's no correlation basically on any violation or suicide that relates to mental illness, to, you know, any control, any gun violence, or, you know, any suicide as well. So how, like, what evidence do you have that, you know, what evidence do you have that suggests that you know, people should, with this mental, without any proof that they should get these rights away, this very fundamental rights away from
Okay,
them?
and you asked the question, what evidence does he
Yes.
have that they should lose that right?
Yeah,
Sam,
so
answer.
First off, as I've mentioned before in DC versus Heller, where the individual right to own a firearm was affirmed, even the majority opinion there said that these fundamental rights have limitations. And when you're talking about saying, like, is there any actual correlation, I say that it's based on a trail of evidence, right? Just looking at the fact that, first off, mentally ill people are far more likely to commit suicide. Secondly, guns are far more likely to be successful when used as tools in suicides. So we can say that, like, even if, so we can say that from that evidence we have very strong logical reasoning that if you ban guns, people are much less likely to be able to commit successful suicide attempts.
Okay, but the major problem is not the suicidal. Many of the I guess, you know, rules or laws that are being discussed is not about, you know, suicidal intents. We're talking about mass shooting and how people are prone to actually having a, you know, control over this control over guns. It's not about suicide or like they take themselves, but it's really about people at large, security at large, right? And this has been the main debate.
Okay, Sam, answer the question. She says the real problem is mass killings, not suicide. What's your answer?
So the reason we brought that up at the start is because we say that the mass shootings issue is massively overblown and that what we really need to be addressing, because it's simply a fallacy to say that we could actually resolve that with that. But what we can resolve is the preventable deaths from suicide, which is the focus of this brief.
And what was the percentage you cited by the New York Times study?
Only 4% of the national average being from
All right,
violence.
thank you. Okay, thank you. Okay, the chair will now recognize the
Will you time yourself?
leader of the opposition for her first opposition speech, not to exceed 7 minutes in length.
Okay. Okay, so topic of this debate is that the United States federal government should keep the mentally ill litigants, and this proposition is to be presented as a policy case in the negative, which means that the United States federal government should not keep the mentally ill litigants. So if I can prove that this entire notion of keeping the mentally ill from guns is based upon discrimination and lack of understanding, then and which fundamentally takes away the due process of taking away the due process of fundamental law, which is the Second Amendment, and I will win this debate. So what is the problem? There's a heated discourse about causal impact of mental illness and mass shootings in the United States, and the need to restrict the gun access to mentally ill. Many attribute mental illness as the cause of mass shootings. For instance, conservative, when it comes to tragic school shooting in St. David's Elementary School in Newtown, in Connecticut in December 2012, conservative commentator Ann Porter probably claimed that guns don't kill people, but the mentally ill do. However, there's no evidence that links this mental illness to violence. Research on relationship between gun violence and mental illness shows that the vast majority of mentally ill individuals are not violent or suicidal. In fact, only 1 in 25 Americans lives with serious mental illness, such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or major depression. Moreover, only 3 or 5% of violent acts can be attributed to individuals with serious mental illness. According to a study done by Duke University, approximately 82,000 people were diagnosed with serious mental illness in Florida between 2010 and 2011. And they found that those with serious mental health disorder with records with public behavioral systems were no more likely than the general other population and authority use of guns to harm others. Moreover, there's a need to distinguish between psychopath and mental ill. Basically, psychopathy is a personal disorder. According to a psychopathic checklist, those who exhibit the characteristic of psychopath include being curious, showing a lack of
Callous.
lack of empathy, traits with PPI described as cold-heartedness. Show a lack of emotion, especially the social emotions such as shame, guilt, embarrassment, show unreliability and irresponsibility, and show a logic and egocentricity. Mental illness is a mental disorder which can be distinguished from psychopathy, which has a wide range of symptoms, which includes depression, anxiety disorders, schizophrenia, eating disorders, and addictive behaviors. So there's a different range of mental disorder. So people who are convicted of heinous crime or mass shooting in the past exhibit shows basically psychopathic behavior, not mental illness. Thus, prohibiting the equal access of gun for mentality is a discriminatory act without substantial evidence and violates the constitutional right of mentally ill. Therefore, the United States federal government should not keep them mentally ill for them. So how big is the problem? So it is a nationwide problem, especially in the U.S. because of the Second Amendment. Why do we have the problem? Because gun control has been always contentious issue in the U.S. According to the procon.org, the United States has 80% guns per 100 people, which is about 270 million guns, which is the highest total in per capita in the world. Moreover, the proponents of gun control law states that the Second Amendment was intended for militias, but opponents say the Second Amendment protects an individual rights to own arms. The guns are needed for self-defense from threatening ranging from local criminals to foreign invaders, and the gun ownership deters crime rather than cause more crime. The consecutive mass shootings in the U.S. that resulted in the U.S. Raised the concern for the gun control, especially those who are deemed mentally ill. But people with mental illness have been subject to discrimination and stigmatization over the years. Mentally ill have been systematically discriminated against the employment, crime, and government aids. For example, discrimination embedded in Medicaid and Medicare laws has accelerated the emptying of state psychiatric hospitals, leaving many of the sickest and most vulnerable patients with nowhere to run or to turn. The failure to provide treatment and supportive service to people with mental illness in both the community and the hospitals has overburdened the emergency rooms and crowded the state and local jails and left untreated patients to fend for themselves. In short, there is a discrepancy about restricting the gun access to mentally ill, which nails down to security for a large population violation of constitutional right for mentally ill as well. However, there are inherent bias and misunderstandings toward mentally ill that needs to be clarified because they unjustly define, discriminate, and stigmatize them. So what is the problem? So what is the pollution? Implementation of behavioral-based waterford statute. So according to an article by Roxana Rodolph from University of Memphis Law Review in 2007, there are two distinct methods when it comes to mental illness. So it's category-based, which puts every mental people in one category, and two is behavioral-based provision, which examines the behavior of certain people and then put them into a certain, put them into a certain provision. So mental health advocates supports behavior-based provision because it avoids the issue of discriminating and discriminating mental ill and add balance to providing meaningful restoration process. The American Psychiatric Association also endorses this provision, stating that a reasonable appeal process may help balance the right of gun ownership and public welfare without applying an overarching categorical solution that is discriminatory and non-specific. So will the solution work? Yes, because behavior-based provision will avoid the discrimination and stigmatization of mentally ill while preserving the security of a large population. And it serves the interests of mentally ill and a large population at the same time as well. So on balance, what outweighs? The advantage of behavior-based provision outweighs the advantage of advantages because it serves the interest of both parties, which avoids discrimination and stigmatization of mentally ill. And it will public safety for a large population outweighs the potential for disarming a large number of individual gun owners.
I now stand open for cross-examination and points of clarification.
Okay. I now stand for cross-examination and point of clarification.
And you stare only at me and not at Sam. Thank you.
Alright, I'll
Okay.
get started.
Okay.
Alright, first question I wanted to ask is regarding your behavior-based prohibition arguments. How exactly will behavior-based prohibition catch suicidal ideation?
So basically, it's not about catch, but it's about avoiding the discrimination. Essentially, when you put certain people in one category without considering their range of differences or like range of like severity, it actually watches how people behave and then determine whether they should be on watch or not.
Thank you. So when you're talking about category-based, you're saying we're basically putting all mentally ill in one category. But don't you think that this plan kind of addresses that by saying, sure, lower levels of like mental illness, things like ADHD, you're not going to necessarily be forced to. You could just put yourself on a voluntary list. But when you have somebody who has very severe depression or who has very severe bipolar disorder, for example, much more likely to commit suicide, don't you think that their increased risk of suicide justifies putting this prohibition on them?
Yeah, but however, a person who is depressed, they're not going to voluntarily register themselves to be, depressed, or it just depends on a watch provision under a profession where they are deemed, or any law officer who thinks they are. So they're on watch for a while, and if they're deemed as a person who cannot make a right judgment, and that's when they get put in this category. So
I get that you're saying the voluntary based part at least might have some solvency issues. But do you think that that's at least better than doing nothing for them? At least having that option?
No, especially when it imposes discrimination, and rather than helping them, it actually put a block on their life, basically. By imposing this kind of discrimination, I think it's a lot better that they're being watched rather than some big things are imposed on them.
Okay.
Yeah.
As far as discrimination, so I agree that we shouldn't necessarily treat people badly and that we shouldn't stigmatize people for mental illness if we're trying to address that. But don't you think that if somebody is, there are these varying levels of severity, right? And if somebody is so mentally ill that they can't even get up, they can't, they're paranoid, they're schizophrenic. We know people like that. I have someone in my family like that. They need constant care. Would you say that at what level does discrimination become justified based off of the level of incapacity mentally?
That's why it's not really up to regular normal people as to sort of judge that these people need help. We're talking about professional models, right? And professionals who are looking for specific ideas or key behaviors that are fatal to this kind of patients.
Okay, but in those cases, you would say it's justified to take away their rights, their constitutional rights.
If it hinders it does. However, most of them, they're not. They were, victims of systematic violence, and they had nobody to advocate and nobody to actually monitor there. This thing was sort of like
Has it been
imposed
3
on them.
minutes or what's
Yeah.
his time?
I was just letting her finish.
Okay, finish the question. Go ahead, yeah.
No,
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
thank you very much. Well, it's now time for refutation. 4 steps of refutation.
How many minutes?
3 minutes. Yeah, and it's the force. You can have a seat, Sarah. A seat. Sit down. Yeah, sit down. And Sam will first tell you. He'll say, Sarah said, I disagree because, therefore, and then you'll do the same, only the opposite way. Sam said, I disagree because, therefore, in doing the 4 steps of refutation. Thank you.
Sarah said that behavior-based is preferable to categorical-based when we're trying to put out prohibitions on guns. And I think that there's a lot of good reasoning behind that if you're talking about trying to prevent violence. But the problem with it is when it comes to suicide, suicide is notorious for being something that's extremely hard to know ahead of time. Even people as close as family members. And, I mean, not to get, I mean, we've known people, I know people in my own family who have committed or attempted suicide, that it comes as a complete surprise to everybody. And there's no way that the state, as a ward, who is not at all personally involved in your life, is going to be able to make behavior-based prohibitions for people who are much more likely to commit suicide. I think that categorical, although somewhat discriminatory, it's ultimately worth it because we're looking out for protecting hundreds of thousands of lives. We talked about how suicide is the 10th leading cause of death. So we need to provide some kind of a quantification as to whether their intangible right to own a gun is more important than the vastly increased risk of suicide that comes from that. And I think that when we're discussing that, she says, Sarah says that there's this right to own a gun, that the Second Amendment right is being violated. But even, as I mentioned, Scalia says that this right is not unlimited. No constitutional right is unlimited. That's why we deny voting rights to people to felons and so forth like that. And I know that that's a behavior-based rather than a categoric-based prohibition, but we have to acknowledge that there are certain conditions. If someone is so mentally ill that they are a danger to themselves or others, that's why we have things like psychiatric facilities, because our society has to take an interest in the safety of its own citizens, both voluntarily for their behalf and involuntarily if it means preventing suicide. That's why even people who attempt suicide can be forced into psychiatric facilities for their health. So we think that when it comes to protecting your right to live, that's the most important thing. Yeah. And therefore, we think that mentally ill people should be denied access to guns, at least at their most severe. And at their less severe, they should use these voluntary-based programs. Another piece of evidence that I wanted to bring out, she said that those in Florida are no more likely to harm others. But I think that first off, I disagree because I don't disagree that they're not more likely to harm others, but I do believe they're more likely to harm themselves. And I think that when you're talking about these sorts of solutions, there was actually an example of the Israeli army putting a policy into measure that was like this, that removed weapons from their soldiers during their weekend off. And they saw a noticeable decrease in suicide of 40% when compared to the weekday after initiating this policy. So we think that the argument that people are no more likely to harm others is pretty much irrelevant because what we're talking about is harming themselves. And when we see that logic of removing guns from people actually reducing suicide rates, we say that therefore we absolutely should remove guns because we don't think that that's at all worth it. So ultimately, we stand proud to affirm in this case that we think that the constitutional right is not unlimited, that these people have to be able to have some sort of measure to prevent the growing epidemic of suicide, and we stand proud to affirm.
Thank you very much. And now it's time for a 3-minute rebuttal from the leader of the opposition, not to exceed 3 minutes in length. And it should be structured in the following way. Sam said, I disagree, because, therefore.
Okay. So what Sam Brady is stating is that this only had this mentally ill.
Who's Brady?
I'm sorry, Sam Brady, sorry. Is stating
Sam.
Yeah, Sam Brady.
That's his last name. That's rude to call him Brady.
Really?
Yeah.
She said Sam Brady
from the beginning.
I missed the Sam. I missed the Sam.
Yeah.
Should we restart?
Yeah, let's restart.
Okay.
Just call him Sam.
Yeah.
Just restart.
Well, should I say Mr. Brady?
You can call him God. You call him God, yeah.
Okay. So what Mr. Brady stating is that this only has to do with suicide, but that's not the case. We're talking about most of the legislation or what the nation is really concerned is about the massive shooting and the violence, and we're talking about the at-large safety here. Besides this fact is that we are still debating whether suicide is one's fundamental right, and we're talking about fundamental right we're essentially talking about fundamental right of everyone, and we're talking about the right that belongs to everybody in the United States. Basically, there's no correlation. Which is the biggest reason why Congress was not able to pass this, because there's no evidence that correlates mental illness to the Violence Act, basically. And it's still on the hunt because nobody can really prove that they have this direct correlation. So is it, I don't know, is it really right for one to actually take away somebody's fundamental right without any data that are being substantiated by that? Is it really right? Because a lot of data shows that they're actually the victim of violation rather than the rather than them actually doing the harm to them. They're actually the receiver of the violence. So for somebody to say that this gun, having a gun access to somebody having a gun just because you are mentally ill and not have this fundamental ill doesn't justify the right, doesn't justify the cause of taking away basically the very fundamental right that all Americans should have. For that reason, I think when a person should be taken away, they should be on a close watch, and they should be closely monitored whether they are able or capable of owning the gun, which I believe is what the behavioral based program will do. It will closely watch them rather than taking their fundamental right away. It will monitor what they could do and what they're not capable of, and it will essentially, if it's deemed that they're not able to, they will take away. But they will also have the process where they could actually redeem themselves. So that's why I think this behavioral categorical program will work rather than the category rates.
Therefore, I urge you to not keep the mentally ill from guns.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Let me make some quick comments. Wow. Well, have you ever heard the expression "two ships passing in the night"? You never heard that? You ever been on a ship? You know what happens when they pass in the night?
You as your comment?
No, I'll just be God from it. I'll film you, Sam, listening intently. I'll film Sarah listening intently. Yeah. Okay, Sarah. It's a metaphor for meaning that you two were talking about at the core two fundamentally different worlds and approaches and policies. And I wish to God that you both had decided to talk about more about each other's policies and clash with each other's policies, because I mean, look, Sarah, and I'm going to criticize Sam in a minute too, because he should know better. But look, Sam strikes out and says, "Hey, folks, there's a lot of bullshit going on in this country. The media plays up all these psychos running around committing mass murders, but it's just media hype. It's fake news." In the New York Times study, they're less than 4%. That's not the real problem with harms from guns. And his second piece of evidence said, and you can't really ever do anything about that. Remember his evidence said that's like looking for a needle in a haystack, right? So that's his. So he says, so what I am going to focus on is this big damn problem of people using guns to kill themselves. Now, so that was his case, and he had a rather detailed evidence that supported that approach. And you kept saying there's no correlation, there's no correlation. He had a lot of good evidence saying that because of the nature of, a knife, a whip, or jumping out of a window or something, it's not quite as fatal as someone puts a bullet through their head, bye-bye, It's often fatal, and that's what his evidence was saying, right? So, what I would have liked to have... So, essentially what you did, Sarah, was stand up and say, no, I'm going to ignore all that stuff that Sam said. I'm going to talk about the problem of mentally ill and mass shootings, because that's what they really are talking about. And then I'm going to give a counter plan to Sam's plan, which wasn't really competitive to what he was trying to do. And it was a lovely discussion of two approaches to gun control, and it was wonderful and all that, the categorical and behavioral. You did a lot of work on this brief. I appreciate that. That was good. So don't think I'm completely nailing you. You did a nice job researching this, but when it came, and it's not really fair because you didn't really have the disclosure like we were supposed to have, and you would have known, and so you could have focused better. So you just had to kind of do it on your own. Let me say one other thing. I actually thought, and I guess I misheard you, but I actually thought you were going to argue something very creative on this topic, which I would have really listened to, which is the right to end your own life is a fundamental right. And the government has no business talking about that and dealing with it. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that's how I pursue happiness is death. And get the hell out of my life. Now, it's kind of radical, but it's interesting, you know, and I would have listened to it. Sam, well, thank you for doing this on the spot. He saw this 5 seconds ago, and he just did this on the fly, which was a wonderful job. So don't get me wrong, but you need to have some kind of observations at the top of clarifying of the problem of the two ships in the night that we're really talking about.
In my rebuttal speech, right?
Yeah, and two fundamental different things that were going on here, and so much of her evidence was dealing with mass shootings. Just as, and so much of her evidence was really evidence for the affirmative. You could have, if you had this had been a real debate, you could have basically turned all of this. This was all affirmative evidence, in my opinion. You know,
Yeah.
most of it.
Part of the reason
Yeah.
I didn't want to focus on that too much is because, like you said, she didn't know that this brief was going to be all about suicide beforehand. So I'm not going to sit there going like, oh.
Yeah,
I mean, most
belabor.
evidence is
You
gonna
wanted to
be-
have a
yeah.
debate, right? Okay, so that's cool.
But I totally get like in.
Yeah. The second thing is you could really. I know you consider yourself advanced debater, and you consider it kind of bullshit that I insist that people do the 4 steps of refutation, but it really would help you if you would do the 4 steps.
I tried to do it more. I had a hard time.
Yeah, I know. And you know, and especially in giving it impact and impacting it out, and telling me what Sarah said and why you disagree, and citing your evidence or it's the contrary, and then the impact is. You know, I mean, my whole team. I mean, you've now seen it in the flesh. I happen to think Sarah gives better rebuttals than half the people on my debate team, if you know what I mean. And just in terms of her saying where she is, what they said, why she disagrees, and giving it impact. You know, these people frustrates the hell out of me. But anyway, do you see why when somebody went out to research this case? No, Sarah, I'm not going to belabor this damn thing. You did fine, and don't get me wrong. But do you see why someone going out and researching this case would never write a mass killing case for the affirmative?
It's too, yeah.
It's too impossible. I mean,
small person's.
yeah, we've had hearings. We've scuffled with this. You know, gosh, because they're so awful when they happen. That poor woman down in Arizona, that crazy boy that, you know, what was her name? From Arizona, the congresswoman that got shot.
Gabby Gifford?
Gabby Gifford, yeah, her husband's an astronaut. That guy was just like, certifiably crazy. But, all of those ones, the kid in Colorado, the kid out in Virginia Tech, the serious people that have written about him say you can't, with legislation, get at solving mass killings short of confiscating everyone's gun. or some new technological thing that's gonna,
Smart guns.
smart guns, or
Even then.
even then,
It's just so random. That's what I.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why this case is interesting, because when I debated for your side in the class, they actually did argue violence.
Mm-hmm.
So I was able to use a lot of similar arguments to what you did. I think I actually sort of cited that same Florida statistic. Although I think that the Florida statistic, that there is actually evidence from that Florida statistic saying that they also didn't have increased rates of suicide.
That's right.
So that would have been really good to bring up. But I mean, there was only the violence part that was.
I wish I would have known what you were gonna argue for. Like you said, there was a 24-hour where I know what I should argue for. That
because you would get the
colliding like this
48 hours in advance.
Yeah, because this will not have happened. But I wasn't really ready for what I should actually review or I wasn't ready for what it's probably.
Don't worry about it.
I thought that you did.
You did a good job.
At least from my perspective, I don't mean to take.
No, go. What I was just going to ask you to do, Sam, is I want you to now give her feedback of what you thought she could do better and what you thought she did well, so she doesn't feel like a worthless person.
Yeah, because I was going to say that I knew that we were clearly talking about different things, but it's you have a whole brief prepared and you're delivering the brief, so that's important. I think the biggest thing is you could adjust what you're reading from the brief, because you obviously can't just throw away your brief and get something else when you're confronted with this different interpretation. But I think that you could focus more on some of the, you don't have to spend nearly as much time on the psychopathic behavior and stuff like that. But the things that you did mention, discrimination, because this is fundamentally discrimination, you point that out. Regardless of whether we're doing it to protect them, you point out, we're just taking a category of people and saying you can't have guns. And that's denying not only their right to own a gun, it's also denying their right to have the choice to end their own life. And we're just doing that, so I think that, you question that, but it's that could be something that you spend a whole lot more time on. And then category-based and behavior-based, I thought was a really good distinction, because I actually made an argument similar to that when I argued, but I didn't have the sophistication of that. I was just arguing, you should just look at what people have done. And even bring that up, it actually restricted my ability to rebut you in a lot of cases, because I wanted to be we take away guns from, wife abusers and stuff like that, but it's that's all behavior-based. So it was that's how, that's not discrimination if they've done something. I brought up felons not being able to vote, but they did something. And so then when you talked about the fundamental right and not being able to take that away, I think that you brought that up in the refutation speech too, and just focusing on that more for engaging the debate. But as far as delivering the brief itself, I think that it was well done. And the brief was very good.
Yeah, the brief was good if it had been a different debate. Let me. Are you done?
There was just one other thing that I forgot to mention, but you mentioned this, and I think a lot of these arguments, because that's what debate is sometimes, bring up arguments and then taking them all the way, right? Because you mentioned, is it right, we're taking away their fundamental right, but they're the receivers of that. So you can say, and why do we have that right to own guns? Why did D.C. v. Heller affirm that we can own guns? An individual right to self-defense. So if mentally ill people are the receivers of violence, shouldn't they be able to defend themselves? So I think that, if you take that and say, why they fundamentally need that right, rather than just saying it's bad to take away the right, but also explain why the right is important, then that would be the last step to really nail in the coffin. But that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Sam. I appreciate that. Let me say two more things. One thing I like that you did, which was thinking, was you didn't belabor the definitions that Sam gave and try to reposit your own. So I was just dreading you going through your definitions again. You remember, I don't know, you didn't come to class that much, but in that 104 class, some people went through last one of the definitions. The government just read the identical definition. What the heck's going on here? Yeah, they just said the same thing. Okay, anyway. One thing, we talked in class, I don't know how, I know you were sick, so you weren't there that much, but we talked in class about, he has to win some real stock issues, it's a big problem. I think he did, the suicide thing. And why do we have the problem? I think he probably marginally won that because of the guns. But the other thing is the solution, and I think you really could have done some good thinking there, because his solution has some real problems. Let me show you why. If you go to his solution, now listen, just I want you to think on your feet right now. Okay. If you go to his solutions, he says, yeah, and by the way, I appreciate you reading the Israeli evidence.
Yeah, I missed that
in your rebuttal. I wish you had put it in the constructive, but it still was good. You were thinking, and it shows me you have good comprehension of reading the brief once and remembering that. That was very good. Okay, listen to his solution. Okay, voluntary list. Okay, voluntary list. Now, what do you think? They can prevent themselves from attaining guns for a certain period of time. Now, think about that. Well, what's wrong with that? Are you going to volunteer, Sarah?
Yeah,
after he brings all this shit, pardon me, stuff about stigmatization and everything else, you go, hi, I'm screwed up. Keep me from guns for a year. I don't know. It doesn't ring true to me that the voluntary list is going to be good. But the real part comes in the second part. It says those who show signs of recurrent suicidal behavior. Whoa, that means.
Recurrent?
Yeah.
What is recurrent? Is that 2 or 3? 4,
I didn't read
5?
that much. Like, what is that?
Let's see. Major depression. Let's see. Damn it. You know, I was depressed when my father died, and I was in New York City with the debate team. I was in a major depression for 3 months. Do I qualify? And then prolonged indicators of violence. Wow. What's a prolonged indicator? You could have made fun of him. What's a prolonged indicator of violence?
Indicators of violence. Why do you even need to be mentally ill at that point? You should just be violent people.
What? And then, or suffers from severe mental illness. Oh, that's even better. No, you're not mentally ill. You're severe mentally ill. You could say, take this plan. This is how good it is. It's just full of stuff. It's just words. And it sounds good. But Sam had to do an awful lot of work. And one of the things, if you were listening carefully, and this is one of the things that I criticized this young man that wrote this case originally, is I said, he admitted it. I said, you really got tired when you got to the solvency part, didn't you? Because we used to run this case. We won one of our national championships when the whole topic the whole year was gun control. So I can do this in my sleep, right? And there are studies, of these definitions in workability and little locales and states and places that have worked it and used it. It's been effective. See, so that's my point. See, you just, but you go. Here's what I want you to learn, Sarah. So you go, okay. Major issues. Did he win significant? I'm not going to go there. Shit, he's got so many. Pardon me. Shoot, he's got so many dead bodies. I can't possibly outweigh that, right? And the inherency, I don't. But solvency, that's always just a great bet. Because, so many times people come up with cockamamie plans and they don't have. And you notice one thing about this, which is, this is the point I was getting to. He didn't read one iota, not one stitch of evidence. Remember, I said the first day of class, we're learning to make arguments from authority. And you're not an authority, Sarah. So if you assert something and you don't have a piece of evidence behind it, I ain't buying it.
That's why I try to put much number.
Yeah, I know you had the evidence, but I'm telling you, Sam didn't, and those were grounds for him not meeting his burden of proof and solvency. So you didn't have any evidence here. Where did he define this? Where did he show this has ever worked? Those are great cross-ex questions too. It's like, okay, that's enough.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you, Sam. I appreciate it.
That was fun. I did that,
I was so like nervous about this entire.
What now?
I was so nervous about this entire thing.
No, you did fine. You did fine.
Okay, thank
Now let me turn the camera off so we can talk about the rest of you.